ran out of page 2. I will have more next week. Thank you. Here, you need this. Todd, plug that into the laptop USB. Thank you. Okay, let's get started. I really appreciated the worship team's words there. While this is kind of a new experience for the U.S., pandemics are not new. The last pandemic, official World Health Organization pandemic we had was in 2009, the swine flu, H1N1, outbreak in Mexico. And at the time of the swine flu, my company was contracted by the Secretary of Tourism for Mexico. I was in Mexico. Yours truly contracted H1N1 swine flu. Brought it back, and it was in inverse. That pandemic, the virus was inverse. The most at risk were young children and infants for H1N1, not the older. I brought it back. Our son was 1 year old. I gave it to him. Kyle contracted swine flu. We were living in Crofton, Maryland. They were only mixing batches in limited doses because to keep the supply, or they couldn't keep up with the supply. We couldn't go into the emergency room. The fever had to be at a certain, extreme nature, so we weren't allowed to go to the emergency room. That was the night that it was at the worst for Kyle. That was the longest night of my life, just walking him around. In the U.S., we didn't. It wasn't much of a panic, but to be in an outbreak zone, I was in Mexico City for weeks at a time when I was there, and to bring it back and give it to your 1 year. You want to feel bad as a parent? Bring back a pandemic virus and give it to your 1 year old. You feel pretty bad as a parent. God was more than faithful, but you remember when his fever broke? We were like, you want to talk about praising the Lord? But he's good, and hopefully we can talk about that a little bit tonight, because we're staying in this concept of what it means to be in a serious, horrible, terrible situation when we talk about serving one true God. Before I forget it, and this has nothing to do with the coronavirus, zero to do with the coronavirus. Next Wednesday night, our midweek, provided there's no other changes that we would make as a church officially, given our watching what the state of Maryland would want us to do as a group community thing, all of the midweek will be on, but we will not have the sanctuary class next week. That's the only component right now we're canceling. It has nothing to do with coronavirus. It has everything to do with the fact that we are installing new lights and new equipment into the ceilings. And so the team is going to be here, and they're going to need, external team's going to be here, and they're going to be installing some things, and they just need the sanctuary that week for us to. We have to bring all of this down and put new stuff up, and technical stuff galore. So I plan to record a video teaching to keep us on track, because we're trying to cover all 12 chapters this semester. But we'll remind you through text. We'll put it on Facebook, but just spread the word. Next week, no sanctuary portion, but everything else, the foundations class will stay on. All the Rangers and Impact will stay on as well. All right, let's jump into it. I'm not going to do any review. That's a first for me. Zero review. So if you want to know what we talked about if you want to see, you didn't have to go that far. If you want to know what we talked about last week, go watch it online. It is actually online. Todd, is it online? Okay, so it's online. I know it wasn't there earlier, but it is there now. We're picking up what we were talking about is that what we see in chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar has come and has completely conquered the southern portion of Israel and has pulled off into exile a ton of people inside of Israel, and has pulled them in to captivity. And in this period of time, we said for Israel, this is a terrible, terrible time. But what we learn inside of Daniel's writings is we begin to learn something of the tactics of how the enemy works when the enemy assaults us. Nebuchadnezzar was known as an absolute, just terrible, terrible ruler, ruthless. Babylon was an empire that is known on the stage of world history. Babylon is comparative to Rome. Babylon, size-wise, Babylon is compared to what the United States is today as a superpower, as to what the Soviet Union was at one time. Babylon is not some small. It is a It was known as a superpower. Nebuchadnezzar was leading that, and so he attacks. And what we see in chapter 1 is we begin to see that what he is doing to Israel has parallels to how the enemy works in its entirety. Verse 3 through 7 says, Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. And among those were chosen some from Judah, the southern territory of Israel: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names: to Daniel, Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. What we says is there's 3 key things that we pull from this text that we begin to understand. All I did with Isaiah, I think I hit these slides last week. I wasn't sure, but this is where we're picking up. All we did with Isaiah is show that God had already prophesied that this was going to take place. That Daniel's timeline around 606 BCE, Isaiah prophesied that this was going to take place in 740. So about 100 and some plus years prior to that, God had already said, this is how things are going to go. And we compared that to where, you say as your kid, someone's going to be crying before the night's over. Remember that illustration? Same thing. It wasn't that God was saying it was a undeniable, it could have been turned around. Judah could have absolutely turned it around, but they didn't, and God knew that was coming in that direction. But what we said we see in this first chapter is we begin to see something of how the enemy begins to work in his attacks. We see it historically with what Nebuchadnezzar is doing to them, but it also becomes something of what we begin to understand of how the enemy moves in ours. And we said the first thing that he does is he attempts to control and change the mindset. He controls the culture. What do I mean by that? If you look at the text, one of the things you'll notice is what is described as who he pulls into captivity. You'll notice he doesn't take old law professors. He doesn't take any older people. He doesn't take any established leaders. He doesn't take... There were certain officials that he took, the king himself of Judah he took, and there were certain officials, but they were just taken and thrown in jail, or they were just killed. But he takes all of the young, and he takes the young from royal families. He takes those that are well-informed. He takes those that would be Naval Academy, Harvard, the up-and-comings of the culture. Those he pulls, and he does not put those in captivity, nor does he kill those. Those he pulls into his own court to teach them the ways of Babylonian culture. What's the point behind that? The point behind that is that what he's doing is he understands, and this was a common practice. This isn't novel to Nebuchadnezzar, but this was something that was consistently done. The idea was that when you overtake or capture another territory, the current culture's mindset, you're not going to change that. They're going to stay true to their God. They're going to stay true to their faith. They're going to dig their heels in. They're going to be resilient because you're invading their style of life. But what he does instead is he goes one generation down to the younger culture. He goes to those who are going to be the influencers later. He goes to those who are going to be the teachers, the up-and-coming prospects, the ones that will influence the culture the most in 5 to 10 years. Who are those people? And he brings those in and says, we're going to change the whole way you guys think. We can't change the way that the 40s, 50s, 60-year-olds think. They're established, so we'll just kill them or we will imprison them. The younger ones, we'll bring them in. We'll wine them. We'll dine them. We'll give them positions. We'll tell them that there are better thoughts out there. There are things that their parents never taught them. We'll tell them there's new ideas, new concepts. We'll ingrain them in our way, and then we will release them back out into positions of influence into their culture, and what's the impact of that? You see, for them to go into understanding their teachings, and you'll see this in a minute when it says the language and literature of the Babylonians, and that we'll look at a text translation here in a minute where actually the text translation should read the Chaldeans, not the Babylonians. They're put into kind of a spiritual school, a school of spiritual influencers, because back then, in a non-technology culture, spiritual influence was a huge influence in the culture. And in a technology influence and in an industrial nation like we are today, spirituality is not as important in a culture like ours. People that go to church are, well, that's good for you. But in a technology culture, what would be the equivalent today? It'd be the equivalent of finding people that are influential in social media, Instagram stars, YouTube stars. Find the young ones. Find the ones that are influencing the culture. Find your Instagram stars. Find your YouTube, the ones that have the most people on their channels. Find the up-and-coming elites in the Hollywoods. Find the ones that have influence through media and those kinds of things. That would be the equivalent. It'd be, let's get a hold of those, because those are the ones that are speaking the most to the up-and-coming generation, and let's get them to change their value system, because let's look 15, 20 years down the road from now. That's exactly what the enemy does today. The influence is to change the mindsets of the younger, not necessarily to deny God, but hey, we're going to teach you new stuff. We're going to teach you other things to control the culture and to control the mindset, and that is exactly what's taking place here. It's not new. It's not a new tactic. The notion that youth are always the most susceptible and influential to the enemy's attempts to kind of change the culture, but today, the things that were considered to be socially wrong, not just Christian wrong, the things that were considered to be socially wrong when I was in high school or in junior high, today, schools, the kids, that's not wrong. Who said that's wrong? The whole mindset of the culture gets changed. So 15, 20 years down the road from now, what does that look like as those people grow up and become leaders in government, leaders in influence leaders in media? That's what's taking place. The enemy moves to control the culture and the space. Nebuchadnezzar's doing that with these young kids. Says the Babylonians. Incidentally, I'm going to skip this live one just out of the interest of time. You know how we do this live thing. I do have one in here that I want to look back at the live. But if you were to check other versions, look at the New American Standard, or if you were to look at a commentary, look at a dictionary. Again, blueletterbible.org, BibleGateway.com, free sites. And if you were to dig into this verse here, or just check different translations, look at the New American Standard, look at the King James, you'll see where it changes Babylonians. I say changes, it translates it as Chaldeans. And the reason it does that is that because, well, it actually literally says Chaldeans. It's the New English translation that puts it into the larger aspect of the Babylonians. But the Chaldeans were astrologers, magicians. Not magicians like Penn and Teller, not that kind of magician. But people who were steeped in arts of source, not sleight of hand, but actual spiritual manipulation of the spiritual realm. Some would focus and study stars and look at astrology. Others would look at things that they could deal with, like bones of relatives that have passed and all kinds of different things. And again, it's not, you have to get out of your mindset, and this is going to make sense as we go into chapter 2, you have to get out of your mindset the Hollywood version of where there's like a king in a court, like Lord of the Rings style, and the witch comes in and she's humpback with missing an eye, and she's like, King, let me... It was not that. It was more like the cabinet of the president in the White House. These Chaldeans, these astrologers, they were officials in the king's court to inform him of any and everything that was taking place. And there were entire libraries where these schools of astrologers, schools of magicians, that they were trained. And anything and everything, a solar eclipse happens. The king wants to know, what is that all about? And so he consults with these, and so there was training that took place. And these were officials in the court that would sit around and say, hey, we have a prophecy from X culture that we once conquered, and we absorbed their library, and we were reading there. And incidentally, you probably know where I'm going with this, that's how the wise men showed up in the first place for Jesus' birth. The Magi were a pagan, astrological kind of seer, and they had already grasped the Jewish readings, and from the Jewish readings they understood the notion of the star in the east, and they came in order so that they might see who this king was that was going to get born. This was an official cabinet position if you were of the Chaldean mindset and of the practice and of the purpose behind this. This is the school that Daniel is being put into. Daniel and his friends are being brought into study the pagan sciences, the pagan religions, the magic or whatever the case may be behind those things, that they are being brought in to learn these things contrary to what their Hebrew faith is. Control the culture, and then the second thing that the enemy will do is that whenever there is any kind of a demonic, satanic influence or whatever takes place that the enemy begins to try to attack us, there's not just the control of the culture, there's the attempt to rewrite the identity. This is where we kind of did our little preview cliffhanger last week where we saw that they were given different names. Daniel, whose name in Hebrew means God is my judge, was given the name Belteshazzar, and I skipped this last week, and people said, why'd you skip it? I skipped it because I wanted to go back and double check because there is debate in the theological realm about what the actual name means because there's multiple meanings, and I just wanted to, I was like, do I have this right? And I think that I do. I'm making you aware that there's different ones, so if you were to go read a commentary and say, well, this one says something different than what Pastor Lane says, I'm acknowledging there's different translations. I think the best one is, which comes from the older, more reliable manuscripts, is that his name Belteshazzar means lady protect the king. Now, ladies, heads up, I'm about to talk about a historical context note. You with me? Not a current attitude, not my opinion, nor the opinion of this church. In those times, women were a lower class. You with me? I did not just say, do you agree with me? I said, this is a historical note that culturally, women were less intelligent, deemed less intelligent, were deemed to be something of a less status, male dominance. And so to call somebody by a feminine name, to give them a feminine, it'd be the equivalent when I was a kid, we'd be playing football and you'd fumble the ball and somebody'd say, hey, get the ball, Nancy. Forgive me if you're Nancy tonight. I have no idea why in my neighborhood, Nancy was the name. If you blew it. Again, I've evolved, I've grown. That's when I was 6. That's not where we are today. We good? No darts? This is a historical note. Daniel clearly has emerged by the point that he's writing here. Daniel's relaying. Daniel emerged early on as a leader among his 3 friends. It was clear that he was the spokesperson for this group. He was the one leading. His name in the Hebrew meant, God is my judge, the strong, powerful name. So what they do is they give him a feminine name. They say, hey, lady. And they change it to say, you're not serving God. You are instead what? Your role now, your purpose in life is what? You're going to protect the king. They've stripped him of any kind of male pride or dominance. It's when someone says the name Belteshazzar, it's like, hey, Nancy, make me lunch. It's intended to be derogatory for Daniel. Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious, and we did this last week, so I won't spend too much here. Gets the name, I'm very fearful of God, so his name is intended to convey that he's fearful of gods as opposed to reverent and worshiping them. Mishael is given to one that says, I'm nobody. And Azariah is given one that says, you will be the servant of the Babylonian god Nebo, not of Yahweh, of your God. You see the name changes? And I said, this exact same thing still happens so subtly today. The way in which the enemy works when he assaults us is the goal to try to get us to adopt identities that he places upon us. I said, a person can struggle with anxiety. And they struggle with anxiety, and for years and years, I struggle with anxiety. And then enough years go by, they just begin to kind of verbally say, I'm an anxious person. And that's a change. Struggling with anxiety and saying, I am an anxious person, you've adopted that now. Person that struggles with depression for years and years and years, and the enemy attacks and attacks and attacks, and you meet him later in life, and it's, I'm melancholy. That's just who I am. They've adopted an identity that the enemy wants you to adopt. You follow with me? It's a spiritual attack that gets people to really honestly begin. The enemy works this thing, and that's why there is so much importance to us understanding that we get our identity from God. You follow? We have a women's conference coming up at the end of this month that Bethany is speaking at, and I think the title is Bethany even. I am who God says I am? Okay, so that's I have no clue what you're talking about, but I'm just running with it. But that phrase, I am who God says I am, that's a statement that people need to hear and live in their life. And it's also important as to why when we go into Revelation, why God speaks about knowing our name and giving us a new name that erases all the junk and the other stuff that we've had to deal with in an attack. And so we see them do this to Daniel, and you'll notice, and we want to watch how Daniel and these guys walk through that. They're in a period where the enemy is trying to manipulate and change the value propositions of their culture, where the enemy is trying to rewrite their identity. And the last one is to notice that the enemy plays the long game. You don't realize it in chapter 1 because it reads so fast that you think that this is like, oh, it happened in the course of a week. It doesn't. Notice the length of time that they were going to be trained. 3 years. Chapter 1 spans 3 years of time. 3 years. They're brought in, they're given new quarters, they're put into this school of astrological teachings, their names are changed, they now have to go to class every day, they have to do what the culture tells them to do, they have to adopt the value propositions and the things of these lines, and they're going to do this for 3 years. The enemy, a lot of times in church life, we think of spiritual warfare is something that's got to be, wrestled with and done with, and, we're going to a seminar this weekend, and we got to beat the enemy in the course of 72 hours this weekend. The enemy is like, look, it's a war of attrition. I'll wait you out. I'll hit you for 3 days this week, give you a little bit of respite, let you think that you've conquered something, and then I'll just come back 2 weeks later, and I'll hit you again. Then I'll hit you again. Then I'll hit you again. The enemy plays this long game. This is intended to be something that consistently wears them down, erases their belief systems, reinstalls new values, reprograms them to think something entirely different. The tactics that we see in chapter 1 of how the enemy works when he attacks is intended to teach us not just a historical lesson about Daniel, but about how the very enemy does it to us today. We've already talked about brass dolphins concepts in our previous, but the concept of behind the brass dolphin was, the enemy changes the culture so that we can breathe in, the stuff that he puts out into the air. And then Christians begin to change their attitudes, and you begin to hear Christians say things that you go, I never thought I'd hear a Christian say that. So we begin to learn things along these lines, but what's interesting is that inside of this, and it's the reason we have the text, we begin to grasp God's meaning of response to this. We begin to see something intentional in the text that could slip by if we don't take the time to read and study, but we begin to see what God's strategy is and what God's doing. It's interesting that Daniel wrote, he says that, and again, it wasn't simply Daniel and his 3 friends that were captured and brought in. There were hundreds upon thousands. That list that we just went through of all the young, the healthy, the upright, the strong, the good-looking, the royal influence. We're talking about thousands of people that were brought into captivity to be trained. But the text says, and among those, there were how many? 4. I just heard like 8 different numbers. Folks, what is going on? I went like this. I heard 6, 14, 3, 2, 1. I'm like, there were 4. Not 8, because it's 4 people that got new names. So there's not 8 people. I just got to, if we're lost on that one, we need to go back. 4 people that were given new names. That's why there's 8 names, but there's 4 people. It says among these thousands, there were 4. And what's interesting that we can pull from their names, because this isn't true. I've heard pastors say this before, and it's not true. I've heard pastors say before that Hebrew names always reflected their relationship with God. That's not you can't let the biblical world become this stale Sunday school kind of teaching where you think of it. The Hebrew world, the Israelite world, the Jewish world was very, very equivalent to our society today. Not everybody was passionate. Not everybody was devotional. Not everybody went to synagogue. Not everybody did. Not everybody was named a religious name. That in the context of it, that while there was a Daniel, that while there was a Shadrach and a Meshach, there was also Billy Bob and Luke, and not really, but you get to my point, is that there were other people that were just named because their mom said, I like the sound of it. There were Hebrew people that had names like, I can't carry water, or, I like to sing, or there were other Hebrew names that had nothing to do with anything, but these 4, you saw their names. These 4 reflect that they came out of devout families that had clearly instructed and taught them in the things of the Lord. Their names reflect families that were devotional to the Lord, that were committed to the Lord, that were committed. So among these thousands that are pulled, Daniel says there were 4. And what he says is, that, did I put it in the text here? No. Why did I do that? I thought for sure that I had highlighted. Maybe not. But anyway, among those, but go back to chapter 1 if you were here last week. Remember what I said. The text does not say, I'm not going to click all the way back to it, but if you're looking in your scriptures, you can look at verse 1, or chapter 1 of 1 through 3. Remember that it does not say that Nebuchadnezzar conquered Judah. It says that the Lord delivered Judah into their hands. That there is a reversal in the story that is subtle in the way that Daniel writes it, is that yes, Nebuchadnezzar came and conquered it. Yes, God was leveraging his punishment for their sin and their rebellion. But in the process, what the text sets up the way that Daniel writes it is that in that conquering, without realizing it, Nebuchadnezzar thinks that he is going to impose his value system upon these. What he doesn't know is that he has ingested 4 devout youth into his culture. You follow with me? That he now has in his court 4 devoted young men willing to stand for God, and without realizing it, Nebuchadnezzar has brought them in. More than that, God has found entrance. You with me? The story starts to change from here on out. The story starts to change that what Nebuchadnezzar thought was his conquering, that what Israel saw is their plight, is their punishment, that in all of that it begins to change, that even in the midst of this, God has found a pathway. It's a terrible illustration, but I'm going to use it anyway. But all of the panic that we're experiencing right now is all about how, this coronavirus that started with, like they say, like 8 cases in Wuhan, China, now is 4 guys are brought into that court. And there's an opportunity now not for just the Babylonian Empire to impose upon them, but from them on the inside out to begin to move God's purposes. You follow? And that intentionality in the text is what's going to set up what I mean by serving one true God in a wicked culture, is that the game plan, and again, we attach this, because remember, Jeremiah is a contemporary of Daniel. When Jeremiah said, and we're still in this series on Sunday mornings, when God said to Jeremiah, hey, you're complaining. Jeremiah was complaining before Nebuchadnezzar had even conquered. And God said, you're complaining now? What are you going to do when it's time to run with horses? This is the running with horses component. Daniel and his 4 friends are going to run with horses. They are going to go, we refuse to look at this as anything other than God giving us the opportunity to turn this thing on its head. It's the reason that Rome, the empire that crucified Christ, would years later declare Christianity its official religion. How does that happen? Because God, for those that want to run with horses, they learn lessons from these kinds of things. So what I want to talk about is that when it comes to living in a culture that is completely opposed to God, that there's kind of 2 sides of the coin for us to learn. In chapter 1, we get to chapter 2, it's going to change in a moment. But when it comes to living for one true God, there's 2 key things that chapter 1 teaches us about what this means. Let me just read the text for a second. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the royal delicacies or the royal wine. He asked the overseer of the court officials for permission not to defile himself. And then God made the overseer of the court officials sympathetic to Daniel. Daniel's already winning people over. But he responded to Daniel, hey man, I'm with you, but Nebuchadnezzar's not going to be so hot about this. He's the one who had decided your food and drink. What would happen if he saw that you looked malnourished in comparison to the other young men of your age? If that happened, you're putting my life in danger, not just your own. And so Daniel then went and spoke to the warden, a different person. Verse 11 is Daniel's going to speak to somebody else. The gentleman in verses 8 through 9 is the overseer of it all. So Daniel goes to the warden, the guy basically who was essentially the RA of their floor. Everybody knows what an RA is? Remember college days, resident assistant, the one that was like in charge of the floor. So the warden, they're not in jail technically. They're living in the king's palace and in the king's court. So he goes to the warden, whom the overseer of the court officials had appointed over these guys. And he says to him, hey, test us for 10 days. Give us some vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then compare our appearance with that of the young men who are eating the royal delicacies. Deal with this in light of what you see. So the warden agreed to their proposal and tested them for 10 days. Incidentally, it doesn't necessarily say it explicitly in the text, but what they're doing is they're still bringing the royal food in. Daniel's saying, we just don't want it. Guess who got it? The warden. So there's a little bit of a benefit here. It's like, you guys want vegetables and water, we're going to do this for 10 days, and if it doesn't work, if you guys look bad, if there's pillows under your eyes or dark circles, or if you're looking out, if your colors are off, then we're going back to it. But for 10 days, I'm up for this. Vegetables and water, but the king still has to think that the food's being consumed, so the warden makes out, man. The warden gets from the king's table. So they bring them in. But interestingly, there's something that we note in the text, and it's what's not there, because Daniel is going to speak up, and Daniel is going to specifically oppose the food. Daniel's going to say, I don't want the delicacies from the table. And I'll make a note here in a second that essentially what he's talking about, that the word translated delicacies is essentially rich food. Again, these kids are being wined and dined. These kids, these young men are being trained for 3 years, and they're being given so that every time the king's table was set every day and every night, a portion came from that table and came out to these kids that were studying in this university of sorts. And the translation delicacies is translated rich food, that essentially it's same as our culture today, that there are foods associated with the rich. Like if I were to say a rich food, what comes to mind? See, I knew it. Caviar. I don't know why that's the top, but that's the top. Caviar, truffles, what? Lobster, if you're getting it the right way up in New England, somewhere, good lobster, not something on the side of the road, but, the real deal. But there are foods of the rich, the stuff that only they can afford. And there's something about foods of the rich and the appetites of the rich that it all of a sudden, that when you get wealthy, all of a sudden it becomes beneath you to any longer go to McDonald's. Probably should be beneath all of us, but it's not, and I still go because my son, I'll use him as the excuse. Hey, Dad, can we get fries? You can get fries, and then I will just take from you. But the rich, when's the last time you've seen a BMW in the drive-thru at McDonald's? The rich, there's something about the appetite. There's this notion that it's not, that the food becomes symbolic of a refined taste. And so this isn't just the king wanting to help them get fed. This is also about changing appetite. We're going to go there in a second, but here's what's interesting. Daniel opposes the food, but he says nothing about the teaching that they're giving. You notice this? Daniel does not say, hey, I can't read that stuff you're giving me. I can't do the books I can't do that. I can't sit in that class and listen to that guy speak on this. I can't do that. And it's interesting that he does that, because it's not as if there are not instructions in the Hebrew laws about these kinds of things. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, there must never be found among you anyone who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire, anyone who practices divination, an omen reader, a soothsayer, a sorcerer, anyone who casts spells, conjures up spirits, practitioner of the occult, necromancer. Whoever does these things, necromancer, somebody who communicates or believes that they can communicate through various ways, even sexual practices with the dead. Whoever does these things is abhorrent to the Lord. And because of these detestable things, the Lord your God is about to drive them out from before you. Not just here, we notice that when King Saul violates this and goes and talks with the Witch of Endor, not Return of the Jedi Endor, a different Endor. Really? Nobody? Why? Why do I try? But there was an Endor in the Bible, and there was a witch in Endor, and Saul consulted her, and God punished him for that. So there were certainly arguments against this. So why does Daniel oppose the food but not oppose the teaching instructions? And here's the point. When it comes to living as one true God, there are two things that I think we need to exhibit out into that world to evidence the truth of our God. The first is this: if we have confidence that He is the one true God, not a true God, not a God, not one of gods, not coexist, not a pathway to heaven, not equivalent to Islam, equivalent to Hinduism. If we believe that there's one true God, part of that evidence in our life is supposed to be the pure confidence that he and he alone is in control, and that we cannot just have demons jump off on us just by simple, resolute contact of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Part of the confidence, pure confidence, and what I said is an absence of fear, panic, or superstition for the God follower, is that provided the heart's orientation is to worship God, provided the heart's orientation is to serve him, provided the direction is to not selfishly or self-centeredly violate God's principles, then there becomes a confidence that the culture around us, the culture that would serve other entities, believe they're serving other entities, we know those entities don't actually exist. We know that those other entities are false. They're hollow. They don't exist. And the reason that Daniel doesn't oppose this, or the reason that Daniel doesn't speak up, is because the instruction to have to sit and listen to it, Daniel goes, I'll sit and we're not going to practice it. We're not going to actually do it. We're not going to involve ourselves in it. But I'm not concerned that having a person speak it while I have to sit here. I mean, again, he's in captivity, so this is a forced entity, but he doesn't object to this. He doesn't object to the books. It's the same reason, if we were to look at it, that Paul in the New Testament can buy meat that he knows has been sacrificed to demons. There were Christians that were saying, Paul, do you know where that meat came from? Paul goes, yeah, 3rd Street. No. That meat is meat that the priest of the temple sacrificed to their God, and then they gave it to the marketplace to make money and give the money back to the demonic temple. Paul goes, I know. Well, how can you eat it? Because that's false. That's their belief structure. That's what they believe. But who created the cow? What's the answer? Who created the cow? And the cow didn't have any say. The cow, by virtue of just random choice, got picked up one day by the satanic priest and taken and sacrificed. Paul goes, this is still God's cow. They don't convert it. They don't, demons don't infuse the meat. It's still God's cow. And Paul says in the New Testament, provided that I give thanks to the original creator of this, I'm perfectly fine. The fact that it was violated in its use by some false entity and some false temple practice, I'm not going to live in fear that all of a sudden becomes some kind of a thing. Now, I'm not going to go to the temple and I'm not going to worship there. I'm not going to go and interact with them. I'm not going to take my money direct to them. But this is God's. I have not a concern by going down to that marketplace and dealing with it. Now, I know that there's another whole passage of this that deals with different conscience levels and where different Christians live, and that we don't pull people over those conscience levels. But the point I'm making is that in this case of pure confidence, part of living in a wicked culture is not walking around in consistent fear and absence of everything that takes place out there, because that evidence is something of a lack of confidence that our God's in control. Are you with me? You sure you're with me? Some practical examples, and these are personal opinion, not reflective of this church, not reflective of these pastors. This is personal opinion. I have no problem going to the movies. Now, don't get me wrong. We are absolutely called by God to watch what our eyes take in. So I did not just say, I'll go see any movie. I said, I have no problem going to the movie theater, provided I know that I'm going to see something that I will be the judge of, that I'm not violating something that God has told me. But I'm not in fear that by being in the actual theater, that because there's another questionable movie 2 theaters over from mine, that there's demonic forces that are going to... What kind of a God do I serve if I can be that attacked that easily? And you can take any kind of cultural example that you want to take. And again, the New Testament... Go back to the New Testament if you need to, but there are teachings on different conscience levels that God observes and God honors. And trust me, if you're somebody that goes, look, I avoid it altogether, God's going to honor that. This is not a condemnation of somebody that goes behind that, but I'm just saying that what Daniel evidences in not objecting, the reason we don't read about this element is because to serve one true God, there has to be something in our culture that proves that we are confident he's in control. Do I dare go to Halloween? I always tell Brian, I'm one teaching away from being thrown out of this church. One teaching. He wants to see it, I think. I think he goes, go for it, dude. This is on you. Put the disclaimer out there. Again, different conscience levels. But if I'm not entertaining, worship of the dead, if I'm not teaching my kid, as long as I'm not teaching my kid to try to communicate with spirits, or if we're not doing demonic stuff, or if we're not doing like when I was a teenager and they would do, oh, you roast an egg over the fire. And as long as I'm not doing it, if the concept is, hey, dress up as Iron Man, and we're going to go get some candy and have some fun and meet some neighbors, and if they come to my house, I'll give the kids some candy, provided I'm not, again, opinion, this is Lane, not the church, this is Lane, not the Lord, this is Lane, so please give complete absolvance of all wrongdoing to the church or the other pastoral staff. But for me, I go, you know what, I'm perfectly fine walking around with my kid, provided he's not, dressed up as the third lord of Satan from the underworld, and if he's not speaking backwards in other unknown foreign languages, and if he's not talking about injuring or hurting somebody else, if he wants to be Iron Man and go to a door and say, hey, guys, some candy, and if I see other neighbors while I'm walking around, I don't have any concern that there's going to be a demonic attack on me by virtue of just walking around. I know that not everybody agrees with that. That's fine. I'm just making the case that whether it's the movies, the same can be said for sending our kids off to secular universities. I would love to see a Daniel model written for the youth going to university where there needs to be a book based on Daniel for Christian kids going to secular universities to say, you can turn that culture and not fear it's going to turn you. But we act in retreat mode. We're always in retreat mode. One true God. Daniel is living in a culture, being forced to live into a culture, but he evidences a pure confidence in his God. There's only one God. There's not others. I know you talk about it. I know you think you serve others, but that doesn't exist. The Prophet Muhammad in Islam, false. It's not another religion. It's not another pathway. It's false. It doesn't exist. It's hollow. It's empty. To stand up for one true God, there has to be a boldness when we walk that evidences, my shoe's untied, that evidences, if I had fallen just then, do you know how scared I would have been? And you would have been like, God just struck him. What if I had just laid there on the floor and not moved? There would have been revival in this room. And I would have just looked over to Brian like this and been like, I'm okay, but just, hey, this is a good thing. Carry me out later. My shoe's untied. A pure confidence. But Daniel does say, but hey, the delicacies, not eating that. Why? And incorrectly, scholars and some theologians have suggested, I've got other examples here I went through, Paul, when he was on Malta and the snake jumped out of the fire and bit him, the natives of that island, that was signatory to them. Not just that it was a poisonous snake, but it was signatory of, the gods, and you have been, and Paul, it says, just shook it off. It wasn't concerned. The confidence in serving one true God is that it's a snake. God will protect. No, we're not going to handle snakes tonight. But there was a confidence in Paul. Jesus, this is something for us to think about in the midst of the coronavirus something, and I'm not suggesting we suspend wisdom. I'm not suggesting we suspend common sense. We should deploy all those things as stewardship of the intelligence God's given us. But in Jesus' day, leprosy was as feared and as they were so worried. Leprosy was a contagious skin disease that over time gradually ate you away until you were dead. And the only way that the cultures knew to handle it back then was that if you were infected with leprosy, then you were sent to live outside the city in a leper colony. Just go die. But you're not staying here because we're not going to touch you. And that's how you got it. You'd literally be in the marketplace and you'd reach over to pick up a bowl and somebody else would hit and bump you and they have it, now you've got it. And so people would hide it, and they would try to find ways because they were ostracized by the society. And so the society's concept of leprosy was you don't touch them. And if you do have it and you're around anybody, you had to identify yourself. You had to yell it out. There's movies that make fun of those kinds of things, but you had to identify yourself. There was a constant fear that don't touch. And so the Pharisees would walk around and have handlers walk in front of them. As the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin would walk down the street, they had handlers. The only movie I've ever seen do a good job with this back in the 80s was Jesus of Nazareth. Yes, Jesus was pitiful. He had blue eyes. He was, Anglo-Saxon, white, Nordic, Jesus without the blonde hair, the dark hair. But they showed a scene of the Sanhedrin walking on the street, and they showed the handlers that would push people out of the way because the idea was that cannot touch this. And Jesus comes along and goes into a leper colony. And his disciples are, what are you doing? And Jesus is of the mind, Jesus goes, I have no concern that that's going to come onto me. I would rather what I have move on to them. And he heals them. The virtue flows the opposite way. The culture lives in fear it's going this way. Jesus goes, no, there's confidence that God will move in that direction. Again, we don't suspend common sense in the midst of an epidemic. But I would love for us to pray to say, God, if you would have me heal somebody, I would love to see the church be a prayer center, a powerful place to say, as opposed to, again, we would act in concordance as good stewards because there's a balance in teaching, and the scriptures talk about obeying those in authority. And if the state of Maryland gives recommendations and we go, you know what, as good stewards, we'll do the right thing. But we're not going to live in fear because that doesn't evidence one true God. That evidences a God that I don't always know what he's doing, so I'll pray, but I also should get 85,000 rolls of toilet paper. I don't understand that one. The second thing, and then we're going to close it up, is that in addition to a pure confidence, there's a passionate resolve. The two sides of the coin to living for one true God in a culture. Pure confidence, but passionate resolve. Daniel says that he made up his mind he would not eat of the delicacies. Contrary to popular belief, it's not because, and I've already talked to you, that this compares back to where the king was giving them these foods, and that if you were to do the study, it's going to say study tip. I'm going to skip this one too. If you were to do a study tip through Bible Gateway, look into some commentaries, you would learn everything I just told you about, that this was about rich foods and about the king trying to change appetite, not just giving them food, but to change appetite, to strengthen them. That at the end of 3 years, Nebuchadnezzar wanted to be able to say that he was the source of their knowledge, that he was the source of their positions, that when they went out into the culture, when they became leaders and lawyers and religious scholars, when they became influencers and politicians, that when Nebuchadnezzar would put them out graduating from his school, not only to be in his court, but to influence it, Nebuchadnezzar wanted to be able to say, that was all me. I did that. They ate from my own table. And so it wasn't contrary. Daniel says it's going to defile himself. A lot of people have said, oh, well, he refused it because it was ceremonial defilement, meaning that a lot of people have said that the reason Daniel said no was because the food was contrary to the dietary laws of that. But there's problems with that interpretation. The first is this. Wine wasn't prohibited by the Levitical laws, but Daniel said no wine. The Persian Babylonian term doesn't simply mean meat. It means a lot of foods. So all the foods, the delicacies did not just apply to meat. The delicacies applied to a lot of things. So it wasn't that they weren't allowed to eat meat. I've heard all these random interpretations. They say, well, the food had been presented to Marduk, who was the Babylonian god. Wasn't there a dog called Marduk? Marmaduke. So Marduk, not Marmaduke, was the Babylonian god that they would sacrifice to. And I've heard people say, well, it's because the food had been sacrificed to them. But that's got problems too, because all of the food in the Babylonian culture was presented before Marduk, including, guess what? The vegetables. The vegetables, the harvest of their farms would have been brought and presented. So Daniel's eating the vegetables would have been food presented as well. And we see other places where Esther, Nehemiah, Jehoiakim, others actually go and eat of the tables of pagan kings. So it's not ceremonial defilement that Daniel is against. What Daniel is doing is he's reserving room for God to be in control. That where Nebuchadnezzar wants to change appetite, and again, not just physical appetite, where Nebuchadnezzar wants to change identity, change culture, where Nebuchadnezzar wants to be able to say, I will be the sole source of who you become. Daniel identifies on the food issue and says, our strength will come from God. And so he finds a limitation. the vegetables. We won't eat of that stuff. We won't eat all the other nice stuff that they do. We will take a limitation that will require that God sustain us. He finds a place in the midst of it to say, there has to be some place where I say, this is God, not something else. You follow with me? It's the reason that Jesus said it's going to be very hard for rich people to get into the heaven of God, for rich people to get into the kingdom of God, is not that you can't be rich. It's just that when you have money to solve every problem that you have in life, where does God come in to answer something? You with me? There's nothing, the scriptures don't say it's wrong to be rich. It just says it becomes difficult because money becomes the substitute. You can use money to do anything, whereas the poor person has to go. Daniel finds a place where he says, there has to be something in this where we are dependent on God. Nebuchadnezzar's giving us shelter. He's forcing the education, the clothing, the warmth. As far as we're concerned, we're set for life because he has picked us to be these influencers and whatever the case may be. We're going to find a place to let God run things. You follow with me? Inside of a culture that is anti-God, that is where do you look and say, I know how God sustains me? Where do you go, this is where I depend upon God? That's something for each of us to independently go after. And I said there are theological threads of this all throughout the scriptures. Gideon has a task of conquering, and he wants to take a large army, and God says, we're going to strike that down. David comes up where an entire army is fearful of Goliath, and David goes, it's going to be 5 stones out of a brook. God's either going to come through or he's not. Moses is told to go talk to Pharaoh, and he stutters. A guy who has a language problem has been called, and ultimately Moses will fail that test because he will argue with God so much that God will have to relent and say, fine, we'll let Aaron do it, your brother. But originally God's intent was, just trust me in this. I'll handle you in this. And then Jesus, born without nobility, title, position, influence, Jesus comes into the world in the poorest of poor, nothing. That there becomes not just that when it comes to serving one true God in a culture that is opposed to God, there's 2 sides of the coin of how we evidence that there is one true God. One is we have an incredibly bold confidence that he is the one true God, and we are not fearful of the things that the culture would be fearful of. But there's also passionate resolve that says, I will set up myself to be dependent upon him in some way, shape, or form. Quick story, and then I'm going to close. When I was in seminary, there was another student that in the interim, between semesters, he only would take 1 semester a year because on the other semester what he did was he worked as a longshoreman off of the coast of Alaska. My seminary was in Boston. His job in the other semester was as a longshoreman fisherman off the coast of Alaska. Most gentle guy in the world, just humble, and he did that to make enough money to come back and take a semester of classes. And he drove this little beat up, I don't even know what it was. It was like a Chevette. Remember the Chevette? It was like a 1970 Chevette. Like one wheel looked like it was the spare, perpetually on. And he drove that thing to Alaska and to Boston every year. And so my third year of grad school, a bunch of us got together and we said, we should help him out because that car, he was just the most. And so we got a bunch of people together and we reached out to the school and we reached out to some board members of the school and we reached out and we looked for some money and we said let's pull together some money, and about 7 or 8 of us through sponsors in the school, we thought we can help him out. Let's buy him a car. Let's get him a car. But we said let's not buy him a car because we don't know what he wants. Let's give him the money. And so we surprised him one day. We went and we talked to him. We said, hey, we got a surprise for you, and we want to talk to you. And we had some other people there with us. Interesting story is one of the board members of our school was Chuck Colson. I don't know if you know. Chuck Olson, he's one of the board members of the school. He was there that day, and we said, we want to give this to you. We just believe what God's doing in your life and what you've done here on the campus, and you've made this dedication. And he said, he's crying, and he's like, but I got to turn this down. And we said, why in the world would you do that? And he said, that is God sustaining me. He said, I pray every semester before I leave, God, if this is you, get me there. And he says, then when I'm there, I say, God, if I'm supposed to be back, he said, for me, when the car dies, I'll come back and talk to you guys. He said, but right now, that is where God is running the show for me. He said, I drive that 3,000 whatever miles or whatever it is, and he said, and God has it was 3 years by that point. He said, I need that, guys. He said, I appreciate what you're doing. He goes, and if God speaks to me tonight and changes it, I'll come back and say, hey, I'm sorry. But he said, but I got to know God's sustaining me in this. And he never took the money. I remember a year later, I was walking by late at night. It was like 11 o'clock at night. It was the start of a semester, and I was going back to our apartment coming from the library, and I was coming across the parking lot. It was like 11 o'clock at night. Nobody's out there, and there's that little Chpt, and I looked, and he was standing over it like this. And I walked by, and Paul was his name, and I said, Paul, I said, how's it going? And he just, hey, Lane, how you doing? I said, you just get in. He said, just got in. And I said, how's it? He said, just thanking God, still sustained me. And so I walked over and put my hands, I said, can I join you? He said, yes. We just said, God, thanks. And as far as I know, he's still driving that car today. I have no idea. But the question is this. For Daniel, it was the food. For Paul, it was the Chpt. We can have passionate confidence in one true God. But what is the area that you would say, but this in my life, this will have to be God. I cannot take a substitute. I won't let wealth do it. I won't let position do it. I won't let fame do it. I won't let riches do it. I won't let my home satisfy it. I won't let my, whatever the case is. What is the area for you that you would say, this is the evidence for me that one true God is, what is it? I don't know, but it's different for everybody. So part of our living is that bold confidence, pure confidence, but at the same time, the passionate resolve. And those two things will carry us into chapter 2 in 2 weeks, where Daniel is then able to stand up to the biggest test that I could imagine anybody standing up for, where he will, without even God's direction, he will tell Nebuchadnezzar, I have an interpretation for the dream that you're about to kill everybody for. And you'll see where he gets that boldness to do that. All right, we're done. I'm way over. See you guys. No sanctuary class next week. 2 weeks from now. And like I said, I hope to put a video teaching out next week, but you'll see posts if we do that as a supplement to this.